What do you think was going through your uncle's mind in that courtroom, and what he might be thinking tonight?
First and foremost, probably thank goodness I only sit here for 3 hours today. But other than that, he must know that it's not going well. And one of the things that I find really quite interesting is the extent to which he seems incapable of connecting with the jury. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing how that plays out. But more than anything else, Lawrence, and I know other people have commented on it, but it's incredibly important. It's the extent to which has no control over the situation, and he needs control in order to project the image that he's been able to project for so long. Without that control, it all falls apart. I mean, we know that Donald is a very weak person, or at least some of us know that, and that his ego is a very fragile thing that needs to be bolstered at every moment. He needs the rallies. He needs the applause in the dining room at Mar-a-Lago, because he knows deep down he's nothing of what he claims to be. You know, he's just this frightened little boy. But with the help of a lot of smoke and mirrors and sycophants, he's been able to convince other people and himself that he's actually a successful, tough killer. And, you know, we hear that word come up, but it's a very important word in Donald's psychological history. And without the control, without being able to control the lighting or the temperature, without being able to leave or use his phone without permission, which he probably wouldn't get, it all starts to unravel. And what I think we're going to see in terms of his desperation in his hallway rants before and after, and his inability to stop glaring at people, or, you know, his inability to connect with the people who have, in some sense, his future in their hands, that he can't kid himself anymore about his power and his place and his privilege. And what's probably even worse, he can't kid anybody else either, and he knows it.
I have the feeling he's always been wrong about how he comes across to people, by which I mean, I know some people were completely charmed by him and liked him. And I mean this in the pre-politician era. But he always came across as you know, just as Spy Magazine called him, a vulgarian, which I always thought was the perfect, if you were allowed a single adjective about Donald Trump. This is a very, very small-minded vulgarian, and certainly what I've always thought about him. He could never have, you know, charmed me in any way, and most people I know. But he doesn't know that. He never had any idea that there were people who were not just immune to him, but took an active dislike for what he obviously represented. And so his disconnect from the jury must also include this mistake he's made his whole life of thinking that everybody thinks I'm great.
Yeah, and listen, he's had a lot of help. You know, fragile systems bend towards the most dysfunctional person in them. And we've seen this time after time in Donald's life. The ground zero for this was my family, of course. And then it was the Republican Party. And then it was the DOJ, both in his administration and in President Biden's administration. Time after time after time, we've seen that people in those systems make a choice, whether it's Aileen Cannon or Bill Barr or the Supreme Court or Merrick Garland, whether it's out of fear or favor, they intentionally or not, consciously or not, come down on the side of protecting or elevating Donald Trump. So it's not any wonder that he would think that he would be able to control any situation he's in. And that's why we're going to be seeing some very potentially disturbing behavior from him in the courtroom and outside of it. And, you know, after what, 4 or 5 days, it's already manifesting itself.
Yeah, I mean, he's attacking the jury tonight. He's attacked the jury once before in a direct violation of the gag order on him. And that's the first thing the judge has to rule on tomorrow, is how much has Donald Trump violated that gag order.
Yeah, and Judge Merchan is in a similar situation in deciding what side, I shouldn't put it that way, what kind of decision he's going to make. Is he, as Andrew Weissman suggests he should, not going to judge out of fear or favor? And that's what should happen, because the whole idea that Donald is a victim here of anybody but himself, or the whole idea that the system is rigged against him and that it's much more fair to everybody else, is just laughably absurd, of course. And it's about time that this madness stop, because we know that Donald endangers people's lives. And we know that as you pointed out earlier, we've already seen that there are jurors who are understandably quite concerned about how this trial and their participation in it, their willingness to do their civic duty, may put themselves in harm's way, which is just unacceptable.
So Donald Trump's defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, said this in his opening statement today. He's not just Donald Trump that you've seen on TV and read about and seen photos of. He's also a man. He's a husband. He's a father. And he's a person, just like you and just like me. Now, I don't know why he didn't include uncle, since you're out there. But so this point about he's a husband and a father, that's the first time. And I've been in a lot of criminal courtrooms watching trials. That's the first time I have seen a criminal defense lawyer describe his client as a husband and a father without having the wife and the children in the front row of the courtroom. This is something that I've never seen not actually made manifest in the courtroom before. Donald Trump's in that courtroom alone. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents were there every single day. It is very hard to find a courtroom where the criminal defendant doesn't have a relative sitting there in the front row.
Yeah, well, a couple of things about that. First of all, it's another example of how he perverts systems or expectations. For anybody else, that would just be damning, right? Just sort of the way he talks about dogs would be damning. How many times have we heard that his bizarre behavior, that he engages in bizarre behaviors or just doesn't conform in a way that a reasonably well-adjusted human being would, but like everything else about him, it just kind of gets baked in, right? But it's worth pausing about how unfair, unreal, bizarre, strange, unacceptable, weird, whatever adjective you want to use, it is that he is there alone in terms of friends and family. I think it is worth pointing out, one, I don't think he cares. I don't think it matters to him. That is not where he gets his energy. That is not what gives him solace to the extent that anything does. He's more upset about the fact that there aren't more people outside protesting on his behalf, right? But it also points to the bizarre thing about my family, that every transaction in this family is a transactional one. I'm sorry, every relationship, I should say, is a transactional one. His kids have decided, for whatever reason, that it's not worth their time for them to be in that courtroom because they're not going to get anything out of it. That's the way this family rolls.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.